A bank is robbed. There are no witnesses. Its president is missing without a trace. When a body surfaced, the criminal investigation grew deadly serious. Federal agents descended upon a small town that found itself gripped by fear.
When the small community of Noel, Missouri discovered their bank was robbed, they were shocked. When the bank president turned up missing, they were outraged. But things aren't always as they first appear. And when clues began to surface, the facts were more terrible than anyone could have guessed. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. For federal agents, the Noel bank robbery became an intricate case in modern forensics and dogged determination.
The Cowskin Bridge over Grand Lake, Oklahoma, just after 3 a.m. The lake is popular for fishing and boating. But on this night, it would be the scene of something far more sinister. A gruesome crime, meticulously planned and executed. A cold-blooded murder that would shatter the tranquility of the nearby town of Noel, Missouri.
No! No! No!
Tucked away in the southwest corner of Missouri and home to about 1,200 residents, Noel is a community proud of its small-town charms and low crime rate. On the morning of October 6, 1989, Pauline Coonrod headed off to work at the State Bank of Noel. The cashier's first task upon arriving was to unlock the front doors. But Coonrod found the doors already open. She thought perhaps the bank president, Dan Short, had arrived early. But as she walked through the building, she saw no one. Within moments, Coonrod realized the vault had been robbed. Noel police and the McDonald County, Missouri sheriff responded to Coonrod's 911 call. The FBI was also called in since the bank was insured by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. An agent was sent to investigate from the nearby Joplin, Missouri office. The entire scene was meticulously photographed and dusted for prints. The agent noticed that the security camera had been spray painted and shot out. Spent casings found below the camera indicated that the robbers used a .45 caliber handgun. Investigators discovered that the thieves had made off with over $71,000, including 320 pounds of quarters, dimes, and nickels. Strangely, more than $100,000 in bills was left behind in an unlocked drawer. Bank President Dan Short was one of 4 bank employees with access to the vault and its time lock. Yet he was the only one of the 4 who hadn't arrived that morning. Questioning him became essential to the investigation. Bank Vice President Mark Allman told investigators that Short intended to work late the night before.
The time lock on the vault hadn't been set the night that the robbery occurred. Dan had came in was in the habit of working later in the evenings, different times during the week, but that particular night he'd put it on standby so that he could come back at a later time and open the vault manually.
Agents wondered if Dan Short had in fact returned to the bank that evening. The sheriff drove to Short's house in Arkansas, near the Missouri border. But no one was home, and his red pickup truck was gone. Short's absence alarmed investigators. They couldn't help but wonder what role the banker played in the robbery. Within hours, word of the crime spread throughout the scandalized community.
Noel's a small town. Main industries, poultry processing plants, some small shops, local merchants, quiet town, tourism in the summertime with the rivers, that sort of thing. But basically just your average small town.
Crimes like this did not happen here. Reports of the heist and the missing bank president filled Noel news broadcasts. Investigators received many calls from the community offering help. One call from an employee at Sibley Manufacturing just outside of town gave investigators their first break.
Hey, listen, come in this morning. I see this truck.
He reported a red pickup truck abandoned in the factory parking lot. The truck was registered to Dan Short. Investigators found coin wrappers strewn across the truck bed. The truck was dusted for fingerprints, but only Short's were identified.
That's a whole roll of dimes, man.
The discovery of the truck gave case agent and 19-year FBI veteran Liddell Farley a couple of scenarios to pursue.
At the end of the first day, we weren't sure if we were dealing with an abducted banker or whether the banker, Mr. Short, had absconded with the money. Stops were being placed with his credit card. Airports were being canvassed. Rental car agencies were being checked to see if he perhaps had leased a car. But primarily we're looking for his body, either alive or dead, in the immediate area of Noel.
With Short still missing, investigators secured a search warrant for the bank president's house, hoping to find something that would lead to his whereabouts.
State police, anybody home? Mr. Short.
Inside, all was quiet.
Trooper, look here a minute.
In the kitchen, they discovered an overturned trash can, suggesting perhaps a struggle. They searched every room.
Hi, come here a minute.
By the bed, they found Short's glasses on the nightstand. He never went anywhere without them.
Let's get some light on in here, sir. I think that's just
It appeared that the banker had left in a hurry.
I'd say he declared. Yeah.
Still, it was impossible to determine from the search whether he had fled or was abducted. With no sign of Short, agents canvassed his neighborhood, hoping for a lead. One neighbor, Carol Dryden, recalled seeing several vehicles pulling into Short's driveway the night of the robbery. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones was involved early in the investigation. According to Jones, Dryden's statement was critical.
Around 2 o'clock in the morning, which really gave us the first time frame, she saw lights going into Dan Short's property, headlights, and then about 15 or 20 minutes later going out of Dan Short's driveway.
But the neighbor's statement didn't put the FBI any closer to finding Short. McDonald County Sheriff Don Schlesman was a lead investigator in the case and coordinated the massive search for the banker in the area surrounding Noel.
We set up a command post on the west side of Noel. The groups were split up, giving roads to walk down. Highway Patrol had their helicopter down, we had airplanes. Just mainly did a search from the air and ground.
Beginning from the location where Short's truck was found, search teams proceeded outwards in concentric circles, hoping to find a trace of Short in the immediate vicinity. 5 days after the crime, there was still no trace of the bank president. As the hunt expanded, Farley and 22 agents from the Kansas City office formed a task force with local law enforcement. To house the large number of personnel, the FBI set up headquarters at the local armory. While they unpacked, leads came pouring in from concerned residents. One tip came from local truck driver Buddy Mills. Having heard about the heist, Mills told an agent about what he saw on a road in Noel the morning of the robbery.
This was 3 a.m. in the morning.
Returning home from work at about 3 a.m., he encountered 3 vehicles leaving town. One truck matched the description of Short's red pickup. It headed off with a 2-tone van. The other dark-colored truck followed Mills for a while until it turned down a road toward neighboring Arkansas. This information jibed with Carol Dryden's recollection of the traffic outside of Short's house at 2 a.m. Mills' account reinforced the time frame for the crime. Farley met with the bank president's ex-wife, Joyce, who had been married to Short for 25 years. Although they had recently separated, Joyce stressed he was a loving father to their 2 children. Having worked closely with him at the bank for several years, she never witnessed any impropriety. Yet Short was the FBI's only suspect right now, and after several days of searching, he was still missing. On October 11th, a couple fishing in Grand Lake, just over the state line in Oklahoma, hunted for a good spot to drop a line. They motored to a favorite shady spot. Hoping to hook some bass, they sighted what looked like a clump of seaweed floating on the water. Moving closer, they made a gruesome discovery. Just under the surface, they saw the head and arms of a submerged body. 5 days after the robbery of the State Bank of Noel, Missouri, a dead body surfaced. 2 employees of the marina towed it to a dock. The body was badly decomposed, but the coroner determined that the man had been dead for 5 days. Immediately after death, bacteria begin to break down the soft tissues of the organs, releasing gaseous compounds. After a few days, the gas fills the corpse and can lift the submerged body to the surface. Sheriff Don Schlesman recalled the bloated remains lifted additional weight from the bottom of the lake.
He had the chain tied to him in a concrete block and part of a chair. And it was a pretty gruesome sight, really.
A corpse will float until the skin tears, releasing the gases. Then the body will sink back to the bottom. If the boaters hadn't seen the body that day, it may have never been found. The time of death was later determined to be consistent with the time frame of Dan Short's disappearance. The sheriff found a wallet in the victim's back pocket. Inside was a driver's license confirming the identity as Dan Short. The sheriff contacted the FBI. The search for 51-year-old Dan Short was over, and a homicide investigation had begun.
With his surfacing, which was almost in defiance of the people who had murdered him, it gave us the knowledge of what had happened, and it gave us the focus that we needed in the investigation to direct resources thereafter.
Farley and his partner Larry Nolan rushed to the lake to conduct their own review of the body. Special Agent Nolan's first task was to preserve the evidence.
Collectively, the decision was made to release Mr. Short from the chair, at which time I released him and preserved the concrete block and the chain hoist, the chair, and also the duct tape.
Okay, guys, that's undone.
With Short's corpse freed from his death trap, the coroner removed the body. The medical examiner determined the probable cause of death was drowning. The chair with the block, chain hoist, and duct tape were examined and photographed by investigators before being sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. The task force set up a hotline and published pictures of the chair to alert the public, hoping someone would come forward with information.
It was clear from examining the chair and the apparatus, so to speak, that was attached to it, and the location of Mr. Short's body, that he had died a horrible death. All indications are that he was conscious when he was dropped from the bridge, some 30 feet to the water.
The hotline was inundated with calls, helping build a file of more than 80 suspects. According to Sheriff Don Schlesman, one promising tip came from an anonymous caller who urged investigators to question two brothers, Joe and Shannon Agofsky.
The Joplin Police Department dispatch received an anonymous call from someone that said the Agofskys had a lot of change in their possession, and a lot of change was what was taken from the bank.
The FBI tracked down 23-year-old Joe Agofsky at a junkyard just south of Noel. The manager pointed agents to where Joe worked on his car.
Yeah, sure. He's working right out there in that yard right there.
Oh, that's him right there in the black vest?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How you doing? You Joe Agofsky?
Yes, sir.
Joe said that on the night of the robbery, he had been at his girlfriend's house, more than 40 miles from
Is
Noel.
she available, and does she live locally here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good.
We're also interested in 45 handguns. Do you have that?
He was cooperative and told them he had two .45 caliber handguns,
Could we see it?
the same caliber as the weapon used to shoot out the security camera. They inquired if they could test fire the guns. Joe agreed and told investigators the weapons were stored at his home. His 18-year-old brother Shannon would be there to meet them.
And your brothers, is this?
When the agents arrived, Shannon Agofsky showed them where the guns were kept. Shannon told investigators that on the night of the murder, he was at his mother's house, where he was still living at the time of the crime.
All right. It's going to be all right if we take these downtown?
After firing both guns, agents sent the shell casings to the FBI lab. Examiners there would later determine that they did not match those found at the bank. To lead agent Farley, it was a dead end.
Both expressed their willingness to help the investigation if they could. Both had alibis for the evening of the crime. Given these factors, our attention was directed elsewhere with other suspects, as both the Agofsky brothers appeared to be not involved in this crime.
Back at Grand Lake in Oklahoma, where Short's body had been recovered 2 days earlier, resident Rowdy Foreman was out fishing with his son and daughter when he made a curious discovery along the shore.
We came across a wooden dowel, a brace, if you want to call it that, and it was just out of place.
Alongside the chair part, Foreman also found a piece of duct tape. Having seen pictures in the newspaper, he believed it may have been from the chair found with Short's body. He sent his son to fetch plastic bags from his house in order to preserve his find. Sheriff Don Schlesman and a partner drove to Oklahoma to question Foreman about the discovery.
And they asked me, said, do you have a piece of evidence? I told them, I said, I don't know if it's evidence. I said, I found a piece of duct tape. And his first comment was, oh my God, isn't that pretty? And they were looking at the fingerprint, just clear as day. There was a print there.
The fingerprint appeared to be made from car grease, impervious to the lake water. But investigators still had to prove the tape was used in the crime.
Although the tape contained fingerprints, that piece of evidence was not relevant unless it could be proven to be part of the chair or the apparatus in which Mr. Short was drowned.
To prove that, FBI examiners would have to match the glue and strands from the torn piece of tape with the tape found on the chair. But that would take weeks. Until then, the FBI and local investigators still had no prime suspects for the crime. A week after the robbery of the State Bank of Noel, Missouri, and the brutal murder of its president, Dan Short, the FBI had recovered Short's body, the murder device, and a possible fingerprint from a nearby lake. Investigators fielded calls from residents who were willing to help, but also afraid to do so.
Due to the manner in which Mr. Short was killed, although the local citizens were very concerned and wanted to be helpful, some were reluctant to do so out of fear. Therefore, some of the witnesses did not come forth. They did so sometimes out of the insistence of a friend or an associate.
Farley received one such call from a man who claimed his friend might have information about the chain hoist wrapped around the chair that drowned Dan Short. The friend's name was Wayne Boutain. Boutain owned the chain hoist, which had recently been stolen. Though he notified the police, the hoist was never recovered. He suspected the Agofskis of stealing it. Farley showed Boutain the photos of the hoist investigators had retrieved from the lake. Boutain identified it as his own. He recognized damage on the pulley. He'd last seen the apparatus at Sheila Agofsky's house where he had once lived. Boutain agreed to take a polygraph test and passed it.
Another important development in the case was the determination that the chain hoist, which was duct taped to the chair, was property of Wayne Boutain, who had left it at the residence of Sheila Agofsky a few days before the murder of Mr. Short.
On the strength of Boutain's statement, Farley decided to question the Agofskys again. Driving up to their mother's house, he noticed an old van in the front yard. It closely matched the description of one of the vehicles Buddy Mills saw the night of the bank heist.
Can I help you with anything?
Yes, ma'am.
Farley questioned Sheila about the missing chain hoist, but she claimed to have no memory of it. She also corroborated Shannon's alibi, saying he was at her house the night of the murder.
I don't know anything about it. I have no idea.
Okay.
I can't help you with anything.
I appreciate your time. We'll be back in touch.
Farley left with suspicions that she knew more than she was telling. He asked the brothers to give their fingerprints, hoping to match the one found on the duct tape. Joe Agofsky complied. When asked about the hoist, he told Farley he remembered seeing it at his mother's house, yet he didn't know what became of it. A few days later, Farley returned to Sheila Agofsky's.
I'm Special Agent Farley.
There he found Shannon with a friend by the name of Gant Sanders. Having secured Joe's fingerprints, Farley tried to convince Shannon to give his as well.
Set of his fingerprints. It'd make things a lot easier. Possibly get you out of some trouble.
Joe Agofsky was very cooperative and produced his fingerprints upon request without hesitation, while Shannon was evasive and hesitant to.
Gant Sanders watched cautiously. Shannon echoed his mother's story, proclaiming he had no knowledge of the chain hoist.
I'll be seeing you guys later.
He eventually promised Farley he'd come down to the police station to give his prints, but he never showed. Although Farley had initially dismissed the Agofskys as suspects, he took note that Shannon and Joe's memories of the chain hoist were conflicting. Now, he decided to take a closer look into their background. Researching the family's financial records, Farley discovered that 9 years earlier they had received money from an insurance settlement after their father died in a plane crash. Popular opinion was that their money was still plentiful, making them unlikely candidates for bank robbers. But Farley learned that wasn't so.
While they had all received a considerable sum of money, as of that time, Joe had spent his. Their mother had spent a large portion of hers, and Shannon Agofsky had a considerable amount of money still in a fund, but it was not available to him at that time until he was 21.
Agents found that both brothers had recently purchased cars with cash, yet neither had jobs. Investigators also determined that 18-year-old Shannon had spent more than $5,000 since the heist. Although the Agofsky brothers' spending looked suspicious, Farley still had no solid evidence linking them to the bank robbery and murder. Revisiting crime reports and witness statements, he made a new connection. Truck driver Buddy Mills said he had seen 3 vehicles leaving Noel on the night of the robbery. That meant there was a possible third suspect out there. If 2 of the vehicles were driven by the Agofsky brothers, then perhaps the other was driven by one of their friends. Farley recalled the young man he met briefly on the Agofsky's porch the day he questioned Shannon, Gant Sanders. Sanders had recently become Shannon's roommate. Farley tracked him down at a junkyard.
The closest associate that we could identify of both Shannon and Joe Agofsky was Gant Sanders. It was learned that Gant had been good friends with both Joe and Shannon, both prior to and after the robbery and murder.
But Sanders said he knew nothing about the robbery and murder, although he offered no alibi for the night in question. Farley decided to question Shannon again, this time with a polygraph machine.
A couple of things about the test is nothing will be painful.
The test was administered in a motel room by a technician from the Missouri capital of Springfield. A polygraph is used by investigators as a tool to rule out possible suspects. The machine monitors the subject's reactions to stress in 3 ways. Tubes fastened around the chest monitor the slightest change in respiration. Low-voltage electrodes placed on the finger detect moisture on the skin.
All right, relax your arms.
And a cuff on the arm measures changes in blood pressure. The examination is based on the body's fight or flight principle.
I'll need you to sit perfectly still.
When the brain perceives a physical or psychological threat, the body responds by increasing blood pressure, heart rate, and respiration. Shannon Agofsky was asked about Dan Short, the robbery, and the murder.
Did you take a chain hoist from Wayne Butane's?
No.
Did you kill Dan Short?
No.
Based on his physiological responses, the examiner determined that the younger Rogowski brother was deceptive about his knowledge of the crime. It was clear to Farley that Shannon was somehow involved.
You do.
But he'd need more convincing evidence to bring charges.
Figure out what's best for yourself.
In December 1989, the Rogowskis were subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury to answer questions under oath. Each family member gave testimony separately. Shannon, Joe, and Sheila each disavowed any knowledge of the bank robbery and the murder of Dan Short. After questioning, Shannon was once again asked to supply his fingerprints voluntarily.
Can you tell me where these are?
Again, he agreed and set an appointment. In Washington, D.C., FBI analysts continued to examine the items sent to them by the agents in Noel, trying to match the chair part and tape retrieved by Foreman to the chair and tape that had been bound to Dan Short. An examiner confirmed that the wood found by Rowdy Foreman was part of the same chair that Dan Short was taped to. The piece of tape with the fingerprint on it was the most promising piece of evidence. But did it match the tape used on the chair and body? It did. Examiners were conclusively able to link these portions of tape by matching the torn ends, the fibers, and the glue. The tape found by Foreman had 2 complete prints on it. They compared the prints to Joe Rogowski's, but they did not match. Farley recalled this finding was not all bad news.
The fingerprint examiner notified me that the prints on the tape were similar to that of Joe Rogowski, but not identical. And he advised me that the fingerprints of siblings were often similar in pattern. Therefore, getting the fingerprints of Shannon Rogowski was imperative.
Although he told the grand jury he would provide his fingerprints, Shannon never did. But this time, Farley would force Shannon to comply by serving him with a subpoena. Grudgingly, Shannon Rogowski gave his prints to the FBI almost 5 months after the heist and murder. Since comparing his prints to those found on the tape would take several weeks, Shannon was free to go. But Agent Farley did not remain idle. He knew that Gant Sanders was close to both brothers and probably knew more about the crime than he had said. So he decided to confront him. He told Sanders that if he was innocent and had knowledge of the crime, he should cooperate with the investigation. But if Sanders was knowingly protecting the Rogowskis and they were convicted of the robbery and murder, Sanders would be jailed for aiding and abetting. Worse, without a solid alibi, he was still under suspicion of the crime. But Sanders revealed nothing. He remained faithful to the brothers. Farley thought that perhaps Sanders was hiding his guilt with his silence. Agent Farley pursued 2 brothers, Joe and Shannon Rogowski, as the prime suspects in the bank heist and murder. Joe's fingerprints had been compared to the 2 found on the duct tape from the murder device. His did not match. As investigators waited for results on a comparison with Shannon's, additional partial prints were discovered on the tape. Now the FBI needed new prints from Shannon, a 360-degree view to match the partial prints on the duct tape. But Shannon was nowhere to be found. Farley hoped that he could get to Shannon through one of the Rogowski brothers' friends, Gant Sanders. The agent also suspected Sanders could be the unidentified accomplice. But cooperating with the FBI would mean betraying his longtime friends. Finally, in June of 1990, hoping to clear his name, he contacted Farley, wanting to talk. Investigators told Sanders they thought that he had helped commit the bank robbery and murder in Noel with the Agofsky brothers. But Sanders claimed he had nothing to do with the crime. However, he did admit to his involvement in another, more recent incident. On one particular evening in late December 1989, Shannon and Joe Agofsky broke into a house in Missouri and stole several rifles. The brothers rendezvoused with Sanders later that evening, setting the second part of their plan into action. The next day, Sanders and Shannon drove across the state line into Arkansas and sold the guns. It was a federal violation. Sanders recalled another time when the brothers tried to convince him to participate in another, more violent crime just months after Dan Short's murder. Sheriff Don Schlesman recalled how the Agofskys tried to recruit Sanders.
And they told him, we're not doing any more Mickey Mouse stuff. We're going to go hit a place, and there's probably going to be some shooting, because they got armed guards. And if you don't really want to kill somebody, you'd probably better let us know so we can take you back home. And so Gant told him he didn't really think he wanted to be involved in something like that, so they turned around and did take him home.
By cooperating with the FBI, Sanders made a deal for his role in the illegal sale of the firearms and was put on probation. He was also finally dismissed as a third suspect in the bank robbery, passing a lie detector test 3 times. With the help of Sanders' statement, Farley issued a federal warrant for Shannon Agofsky. He was indicted for transporting and selling firearms across state lines. Since Joe had not been involved in the sale, he was not charged. Authorities tracked down Shannon in a small town in Arkansas several months later. When apprehended, police searched his vehicle and found several bags of nickels in his trunk. Shannon was turned over to authorities in Missouri and booked in the Springfield Federal Courthouse.
Look at me.
While being processed, Farley acquired the set of Shannon's fingerprints examiners had been waiting for. The FBI lab needed a front and back view of his prints, hoping to match 2 partial prints found on the duct tape used in the murder of Dan Short. But his older brother Joe was still free, and Farley had little evidence to tie him to the crimes. Investigators knew the brothers remained in contact while Shannon was behind bars. Since all prison conversations were recorded, agents got a glimpse into the Agofsky's family relationship. Shannon made a number of calls to his mother and Joe. According to Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones, one call was particularly incriminating.
Shannon was asking Joe if we would be able to make a case against him, and Joe indicated that we would not be able to put him at the scene.
Farley knew the brothers were worried, but the call was not enough to arrest Joe. Then, just days later, he finally received the results from the lab.
Those fingerprints turned out to be the fingerprints of Shannon Agofsky. The tape was determined to have come from the chair in which Mr. Short was bound to. Therefore, that piece of tape became a most important piece of evidence in this case.
Mike Jones now had a strong case against Shannon.
We knew we were going to prosecute Shannon once we got those first 2 fingerprints, and then the main focus was on Joe, trying to get a case built against Joe.
How's it going?
Finding evidence against Joe was a thorny task. Nothing directly linked him to the crime.
I got some.
Once again, Farley combed through financial records to see how much Joe had spent.
Good, yeah.
We attempted to determine all his cash transactions and did determine that he had spent some $19,000 in cash during the 16 months following the robbery. During that time, he was unemployed and had no logical explanation for having that much cash.
Scrutinizing Joe's phone records, Farley made another important find. Joe had made several long-distance calls to his girlfriend at her home during the very days leading up to and after the robbery.
Yeah.
The calls destroyed his alibi. Joe had stated that he was staying with her the entire time.
Not too smart.
They called Sanders in for additional questioning, hoping he could shed more light on Joe's involvement. Sanders told the agents about a conversation he had with both Agofsky brothers. That incident took place in Sammy Skaggs' junkyard.
The three of them were working on one of the cars, and Sammy Skaggs announced that the banker from Joplin was here to pick up his car. And that apparently generated a comment from, I believe it was Joe, that what the three of them ought to do was to follow a banker, follow him home, grab him, kidnap him, and force him to take him to the bank and open the vault.
At the time, Sanders agreed that it might be an easy way to get rich. The plan sounded eerily like what could have happened to Dan Short. It was now clear to the FBI that the brothers had the knowledge, motive, and opportunity to pull off the homicide and heist. Based on accumulating evidence, Joe Agofsky was arrested more than 2 years after the horrifying crime. Both brothers were indicted on 3 federal counts relating to the bank robbery and murder. But would the evidence be strong enough to convict the 2 brothers? The investigators were betting on it. Almost 3 years after a bank heist and brutal murder, FBI agent Liddell Farley handed prosecutors all the evidence the task force had amassed. Reviewing their files, the agents described the Agofskys' plans and actions to Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones and his associates. They were determined to prove beyond any doubt that the brothers had committed the crime. The FBI had learned that Joe Agofsky, needing information about the state bank's floor plan, had opened a safe deposit box a few weeks before the crime. Bank Vice President Mark Ullman told investigators that Joe was particularly interested in Dan Short as well. He made a point of asking who Short was and where he lived.
He's our president. Would you like to meet him?
Oh, no, thanks. I was just asking who he was.
Returning home, Joe drew floor plans to the bank and plotted the crime with Shannon. They decided to do the job before the sun rose, so there would be no witnesses.
We're gonna get through the front door. When we get through there, I want you guys to knock the cameras out.
To get into the vault, they needed someone who had the keys and knew the combination.
Make sure get them keys.
For that, they would abduct Dan Short, the bank president, and force him to open the vault. Afterwards, they needed to make sure he'd never talk.
Don't give that combination up.
They thought it would be easy money. Life would be good with their new fortunes.
Let's get these guns clean.
In the early hours of October 6th, Joe and Shannon Agofsky put their plan into motion. Acting as a lookout for them was an unidentified accomplice who drove the blue Chevy pickup. It was the same vehicle neighbor Carol Dryden recalled seeing around Short's house a week before the kidnapping. The brothers loaded their mother's brown and tan van with the equipment they would need to commit the crime. At around 2 a.m., they arrived at Dan Short's house, a brief trip across the Arkansas border. Eventually, he awoke from a deep sleep. The intruders would be the last people he ever saw.
Get out of here.
Short tried to flee, but he had no chance against the brothers and their accomplice. They threatened to kill him unless he turned over his keys to the bank. Silencing him, the intruders dragged Short outside. The terror continued as Short was stuffed into the front seat of the van. Each criminal drove one of the vehicles, including Short's red pickup, as they sped off for the bank. Agent Farley and the prosecutors continued piecing together the events of October 6th. The Agofskis and their accomplice pulled up to the bank, only a brief drive from Short's house. With their captive in tow, the robbers quickly opened the bank's front door and ran in. No alarm sounded because Short had neglected to set them, and no one would ever be able to see what was about to happen.
Let's go to that desk.
After ripping the duct tape off his mouth, they pulled Short over to his desk and retrieved the keys to the safe.
7 left.
Then they forced him to provide the vault's combination.
Hurry up. 42 right.
Once inside, they grabbed all that was in reach.
Get him out. Get out.
And dashed away.
Go. I'll blow your head off. Move it.
They dumped the loot in the truck. Afraid for his life, Short complied with their every demand. But the assailants pistol whipped him and knocked him out. On the way out of Noel, Buddy Mills crossed paths with the brothers. After he passed the intersection, the 3 vehicles sped off, the first 2 heading toward Grand Lake. Reaching Grand Lake, some 22 miles from Noel, the 2 remaining vehicles stopped along the high point of the Cowskin Bridge. Here, Shannon and the unknown accomplice prepared to kill Short by drowning him. In his haste, Shannon took off his gloves to secure a portion of the tape.
Shut up!
And unknowingly left greasy fingerprints behind.
Stop! What are you doing? Stop! Don't do this.
Then the 2 attached the stolen chain hoist.
I'll do anything. Anything you want.
When they finished, they lifted Short above the lake.
Oh, no! No!
And plunged him into the black water below. At the first trial in September 1992, the evidence was strong enough to persuade a jury to convict Shannon and Joe Agofsky of 3 federal crimes relating to the robbery, abduction, and use of firearms during the illegal acts. In the state trial, only Shannon was found guilty of murder. Though the unidentified accomplice was never found, it was determined that the Agofsky brothers were the masterminds and principal perpetrators of the crime. No charges were brought against their mother, Sheila.
Without doubt, this was the most difficult investigation I've been involved in as an FBI agent. Some 29 years of investigating various crimes. This was an unusually heinous crime.
Today, Joe and Shannon Agofsky are serving life sentences with no chance of parole. For his cooperation, Gant Sanders served the remainder of his firearms charge on probation. Noel has returned to normal, a violent chapter in its history now closed. Yet because of the crimes of these blood brothers, it will never be the same quiet, innocent place it once was. A Labor Day weekend turned into a nightmare of murder as a cross-country crime spree terrorized the nation. A pair of suspected spree killers traveled through state after state, leaving murder victims in their wake. Working against time, the FBI and local authorities marshaled their resources to stop the killings.
In a small Ohio community, an elderly woman and a teenage boy disappeared. Because they vanished within hours of each other, police believe the cases were linked, but they didn't know how. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. A trail of stolen vehicles and murder victims across 7 states led the FBI on a hunt for 2 serial killers. Their only hope of stopping them was to anticipate the killer's next move.
August 29th, 1994. Summer was drawing to a close in the small town of Port Washington, Ohio. The peaceful farming community was dotted with isolated rural homes. A 79-year-old widow, Ruth Loader, lived alone. Those of her family that lived nearby kept a close eye on Mrs. Loader since she was battling with cancer. When she heard footsteps in the kitchen, she thought it might be her granddaughter returning to see her before she went to sleep. She discovered strangers instead. The following morning, the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office received an urgent call from Mrs. Loader's sister. As was their routine, Mrs. Loader's sister and son-in-law came to check on the sick woman, but found Mrs. Loader and her car missing. Sheriff Walter Wilson, a detective lieutenant at the time, was the lead investigator.
Family members had seen Mrs. Loader the evening prior to the morning of her disappearance. She was fine at that time. They had indicated to us that Mrs. Loader was recovering from cancer surgery, that she definitely needed medication, which was left behind.
The family was worried since Mrs. Loader was so weak. She would become very ill if she was without her medication for long. Marks on the back door and damage to the door frame indicated it had been kicked in. The forced entry told the sheriff that the frail woman had not left of her own free will. Mrs. Loader's purse was left behind, but her cash was missing, along with the keys to her red Buick. Sheriff Wilson immediately issued an all-points bulletin for the widow and her car.
Sheriff's Department.
He knew that they'd have the best chance of finding her alive if they acted quickly.
We felt very early on that Mrs. Loader obviously had been kidnapped. We immediately began a massive search for Mrs. Loader and her car. Then that involved all of the area law enforcement agencies. It involved numerous fire department personnel. Citizens from the area came out in droves and helped with the search for Mrs. Loader.
I need you two to work rush. We're going to try to stay in this general area.
Concerned over her fate, the community was united in its pursuit.
We have to finish before they do. Okay?
The command center was formed in the Port Washington Fire Station, where authorities worked with volunteers to plan the urgent search for the ailing woman. If she didn't have her medicine soon, her condition could become critical. They had to find the grandmother before it was too late.
Report back here every 2 hours and let us know. Okay?
Mrs. Loader was pretty well known in that area. It's a very good family. They're very highly thought of, and everyone was very concerned for her and felt obligated and really sincerely wanted to try to find her to help her.
Mounted reserve units geared up to comb rougher terrain on horseback. Local police and neighbors searched fields and woods for any trace of her or the missing car. Sheriff's deputies from a neighboring county brought in canine units hoping to pick up a scent. The Ohio State Highway Patrol ordered their aircraft to scan roads from above. The extensive search turned up no trace of Mrs. Loader or her car. Special collections were taken at restaurants and grocery stores to help pay for additional personnel. Deputies alerted the media while family members posted flyers in neighboring towns, hoping to get the word out beyond the local community. That afternoon, a woman who knew Mrs. Loader called the sheriff's office with information and came in for an interview.
Appreciate you coming in.
You know, I heard about Mrs. Loader's disappearance.
She told investigators that she'd seen Mrs. Loader's red Buick in town at about 11 p.m. the previous evening. She thought it was strange that the ailing woman would be driving that late. Though the light was dim, she could see that a young man was driving the car.
Just kind of went
Bushy and thrown back.
not too bushy, not in your
The witness tried her best to help a police artist construct a composite sketch from what she could remember of the brief encounter.
Is that him?
In the area surrounding Port Washington, Ohio, concern that a criminal could be on the loose spread fear in a community that was not used to locking their doors. Police showed the composite sketch at every interview, but no one could identify the man depicted in the drawing. The day ended with no new leads. On day 2 of Mrs. Loader's disappearance, a deputy entered her case into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer system linking 57,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
Sheriff's Department.
That same day, the sheriff's office fielded a call from some concerned parents.
Can you describe him for me?
Their 16-year-old high school sophomore had also disappeared from Tuscarawas County.
Okay, his clothing, jeans.
In nearby Newcomerstown, 3 miles from the
Any
house where Mrs.
scars,
Loader
tattoos,
disappeared,
body marks?
a worried father and stepmother told a sheriff's deputy their son was missing. His family and his former employer had not heard from him for 3 days.
His red shirt. Do you have a picture of him?
Yes, I do.
One other thing too, officer.
A .22 caliber handgun was also missing from the house.
Is it silver?
The parents gave authorities a photograph of the missing boy, Eric Elliott.
It seemed kind of ironic at the time that we would have Mrs. Loader missing and that we would also have a juvenile reported missing within that short distance.
Ohio investigators wondered if there was any connection between the 2 disappearances from the same county. Just 36 hours after Mrs. Loader's abduction, Sheriff Wilson received another call.
Hello?
650 miles west in Fulton, Missouri, police found a red Buick stuck in a farmer's muddy field. When they ran its Ohio plates through the NCIC, they discovered it was Mrs. Loader's stolen car. The farmer had not seen who had abandoned it. The car's keys were missing, but the doors were unlocked. Among the items officers found inside was a green soda bottle and a sandwich wrapper labeled Goshen Dairy Store. They towed the vehicle to the station for further examination. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler from the Callaway County Sheriff's Office in Fulton, Missouri, was assigned to lead the investigation. His department's first task was to check the car's locked trunk.
We weren't sure exactly what we were going to find. We had a missing lady from Ohio, and this was her car, so we were under the assumption that very possibly we may find a body when we opened up the trunk.
Investigators needed to open it without damaging evidence or injuring the woman if she was unconscious inside. An auxiliary deputy who was a locksmith was called in. They discovered the trunk was empty. After 3 days of searching, hope of finding Mrs. Loader alive was beginning to fade. On September 1st, an FBI evidence recovery team from Kansas City was called in, since the missing woman's car had crossed state lines. Agents worked with local authorities processing Mrs. Loader's car for forensic details. They gathered several sets of prints and hairs. In Ohio, the foreign prints were entered into an automated fingerprint system, but no matches were found. Sheriff Wilson prepared to travel to Missouri. On a hunch, he took along a photo of the missing teenager, Eric Elliott.
At the time, it was nothing concrete as far as connecting Mrs. Loader's disappearance and Mr. Elliott's report of his son missing. However, I felt that since we're going to Callaway County, you know, it would make sense to maybe obtain a photograph of the missing juvenile and take with us.
Mrs. Loader's son-in-law joined the sheriff to help in the investigation.
See what we can do.
The Missouri official did not recognize the photo, but the Ohio sheriff did recognize the sandwich wrapper found in the car. It was from Goshen Dairy, a store near Mrs. Loader's house. Her son-in-law said the family kept her vehicle clean. Perhaps Eric Elliott, who also lived close to the store, had left the wrapper in the car.
They had a photograph of Elliott with them, and we decided to cover Kingdom City, where they would have gotten off the interstate.
Ohio and Missouri investigators checked exits along nearby I-70, a major east-west route in the region. They hoped someone at the rest stops would be able to confirm that Elliott had been in the area. They spoke to dozens of employees and travelers. Late in the afternoon, their efforts finally paid off.
You haven't seen him since then?
No, I haven't.
They found one person who remembered seeing the teenager the day before. Unfortunately, authorities found no one who remembered seeing Mrs. Loader or her car. For the first time, investigators considered 16-year-old Eric Elliott as a suspect in her abduction. Missouri deputies also continued to canvass the rural Fulton area, inquiring if neighbors had seen anything unusual. At the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found, an officer knocked on the door of an elderly couple, William and Flossie Brewer. He heard their dog, but the couple appeared to be out. Since their car was not parked outside, the deputy continued on. Authorities checked dozens of homes, but found no one close by who had seen Eric Elliott or Mrs. Loader.
I was on my way home. After finishing that up, I received a page from the communications center that they wanted me to call them immediately. They told me that they had found two bodies at a farmhouse out on County Road 147.
It was the home of William and Flossie Brewer, the house closest to the field where Mrs. Loader's car was found earlier that day. Authorities believe the two crimes were likely connected. 3 days after Mrs. Loader's disappearance, sheriff's detectives found the bodies of 86-year-old William Brewer and his 76-year-old wife Flossie in the basement of their home. Each had multiple gunshot wounds.
They were slumped over. They were near the door. She had her hands tied behind her back, with what appeared to be a telephone cord, and he was on her right, slumped over also, and his cane was standing there right beside him.
The detective also found the couple's dog faithfully guarding their lifeless bodies. An autopsy later determined that both Mr. and Mrs. Brewer had each been shot 3 times in the head with a .22. the same caliber weapon missing from Eric Elliott's home. The 16-year-old suspected in the disappearance of Mrs. Loader now became a suspect in the double homicide.
There was no indication that the suspect had spent any length of time in the house before this occurred. So from the evidence, it pointed us that it had happened relatively quickly.
Investigators found no signs of forced entry. In the basement, the door to the outside was covered with cobwebs, indicating it had not been opened.
It was yesterday. Now,
Investigators spoke with the brewer's son. He said the couple's Oldsmobile was missing, along with several rifles.
Missing from around the house.
All were entered into the NCIC.
Yeah, the gun's missing and the car.
The son added that his mother's bedspread was also missing. Technicians worked the scene until 5 a.m. On the floor near the front entrance, investigators found two distinct sets of footprints foreign to the house.
Did they keep a key for this?
One appeared to be a tennis shoe, the other a hiking boot. Investigators suspected the double homicide was likely connected to Mrs. Loader's disappearance. What they didn't know was if 16-year-old Eric Elliott and a companion had become spree killers. By September 2nd, 1994, 4.5 days had passed since the ailing Ruth Loader was forced from her Ohio home without her medication. She was missing and presumed dead since her stolen car was found abandoned in Missouri, 150 yards from where police discovered a slain elderly couple. Authorities suspected an Ohio teenager named Eric Elliott and at least one companion were responsible for the crimes. But they had no direct evidence. Lieutenant Timothy Daimler of the Callaway County, Missouri Sheriff's Department recalled that citizens in the surrounding areas were stunned.
These are people that live in the rural community. They're used to leaving their doors unlocked. They do know everybody. And I think it was somewhat of a realization that, unfortunately, even though you do live in a rural community, that you still have to lock your doors and pay attention to when strangers are in your neighborhood.
With 2 confirmed homicides and a likely third in as many days, local authorities turned to the FBI for help. Special Agent Peter Christ of the FBI's Canton, Ohio resident agency was assigned the case. To catch up with the suspected spree killer and his companion, they needed an idea of where Eric Elliott might be heading.
So we were trying to get as much background information as we could. We were looking for relatives, uncles, aunts, cousins, friends. We were convinced that they were heading across the country, and we just needed to know everybody that there was a possibility that they would stop and visit, to either visit to say hello or get any kind of financial or moral support.
Can I call you TJ? Yeah, you seem like a nice enough.
Agents asked one of Eric Elliott's friends to come in for questioning. The friend told them that Elliott had recently become very close to a young ex-convict named Lewis Gilbert. He said that Gilbert and Elliott had spent a lot of time together over the past few weeks. Both had been complaining about how boring life was in the small town and that there was no reason for them to stay. Gilbert was estranged from his wife and son, and Elliott wished to visit his birth mother in California.
I just got out of jail. Hello?
The friend added that the pair mentioned they wanted to do something that would make them go down in history and planned to start by stealing a car.
They mentioned that we were drinking and got the talk.
The last time he saw them was 5 days ago, when Gilbert and Elliott were walking along railroad tracks behind Mrs. Loader's house. Because Elliott was a troubled teen, Agent Christ believed that he probably looked up to 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert, since Gilbert appeared to do as he pleased.
At the point when Gilbert befriended Elliott, he had been released from jail 2 weeks prior to that. Had a criminal history, had a history of getting in trouble. And at that point, we sort of felt that maybe Mr. Elliott was in awe or enamored with Mr. Gilbert because he did have that kind of criminal history background.
Investigators dug deeper into Lewis Gilbert's past. The 22-year-old had served time for stealing a boat and breaking and entering. He had also been convicted of physically abusing his 3-month-old son. Though agents still lacked concrete evidence that Gilbert and Elliott were traveling together, they needed to find them as soon as possible to prevent any more killing.
Our biggest concern at this point was that we suspected these two of Mrs. Loader's disappearance. They were strong suspects in the killings and the double homicide in Missouri, and we were very concerned that this kind of activity would continue all the way across the country.
Sheriff Wilson's first step was to see if anyone had seen Gilbert with Elliott at the Goshen Dairy store, close to Mrs. Loader's Ohio home. Missouri investigators had found a sandwich wrapper from the store in Mrs. Loader's abandoned vehicle.
Does this look familiar to you?
Yeah. One of our wrappers for a sandwich.
The clerk identified the wrapper.
That you sell here at this store?
She also remembered selling the sandwich and some soda to Gilbert and Elliott just after Mrs. Loader disappeared. Authorities now had confirmation the young men were traveling together.
Thank you.
But 5 days had already passed since the spree killers had begun their cross-country rampage. The FBI quickly secured arrest warrants for kidnapping and burglary in the Ruth Loader disappearance. Though agents believed the pair was also responsible for the double homicide in Missouri, authorities still lacked evidence to formally charge them with those crimes. Agents weren't about to wait for someone to call in. Anticipating Gilbert and Elliott's westward movement, the FBI visited Gilbert's mother in Tahlequah, Oklahoma on September 3, 1994. The agent warned her that her son and his friend were armed fugitives, suspected of driving a stolen Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. It was possible that the pair would visit her for help.
I need to know if you've seen them recently.
Oh, they just left this morning.
This morning?
The FBI had just missed them. Gilbert and Elliott had arrived at 2 a.m. the previous day. Gilbert claimed the Oldsmobile they were driving belonged to a friend. They said they were headed to California. The pair spent the day and left a few hours before the agent arrived. Cooperating with the FBI, she described the clothes the pair was wearing and gave agents addresses of other relatives. Authorities feared that if they didn't catch up with them soon, the spree killers would strike again.
That was one of the most frustrating things about this whole investigation. It just appeared that we were always a half a day or a day behind them. And that's probably one of the most frustrating things. We just couldn't get ahead of them.
Because Eric Elliott was a minor, investigators needed court permission to distribute his photo. They got the go-ahead 36 hours after the double homicide in Missouri. Lieutenant Daimler added it to the nationwide bulletins for the fugitives.
I was scared to see where they were going to end up next and who they were going to kill next. And I wanted to do everything I could to help get those people off the street, because it was apparent to me that they didn't care who they killed.
Despite the best efforts of authorities, the urgent hunt for the suspected killers stretched into its 6th day. On September 4th, 1994, 165 miles west of Gilbert's mother's house in Oklahoma, a dirt biker was riding the rural trails around Draper Lake, just outside of Oklahoma City. His ride was cut short when he discovered a woman's body amongst the trees. As he raced to summon police, he rode around an Oldsmobile with Missouri plates. Almost a week after Mrs. Loader's abduction in Ohio, the nationwide hunt for 2 suspected killers would continue. By September 4th, 1994, 6 days had elapsed in the FBI's massive nationwide search for a pair of suspected spree killers. Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott were wanted for a possible murder in Ohio and a confirmed double homicide in Missouri. The fugitives were last seen in Oklahoma, heading west. That same day, Oklahoma City police responded to a call from a dirt biker who had discovered a woman's body near Draper Lake. Officers secured the crime scene, then called in homicide detectives. They interviewed the biker who had made the discovery. Homicide Inspector Bob Bemo of the Oklahoma City Police Department was assigned the case.
Once we come upon the immediate scene where the body was located, I observed the young woman to be in a kind of a bent over backwards and caught between a tree.
The victim was a white female in her 30s. Investigators found no identification on or near the body. But a manager at a nearby marina later identified her as his missing employee, Roxy Ruddle.
As a part of our investigation, another vehicle had been found a short distance away from where the victim had been located. And we didn't know if this was a part of the crime or not, although we did secure the area around this vehicle.
When detectives checked the Oldsmobile's Missouri plates with the NCIC, they discovered the car had been reported stolen from the Brewers, the double homicide victims from Missouri. Oklahoma investigators immediately notified authorities back east. To Tuscarawas County Sheriff Walter Wilson in Ohio, it appeared that Gilbert and Elliott had struck again.
They had recovered Missouri's stolen vehicle, and they also had another murder victim. It's just another terrible feeling that's really hard to describe, that obviously this tragedy continues.
Oklahoma police crime technicians gathered evidence from the vehicle. They recovered several unused .22 caliber bullets. A pawn shop receipt from a local Oklahoma City store was also found. Prints lifted from inside and outside the car matched both Gilbert and Elliott's. Oklahoma medical examiners determined that Ruddle's death had occurred in the last day or two, since there was little decomposition. Death had been inflicted by a .22 caliber weapon. Detectives notified the woman's devastated husband. He informed them that her two-toned pickup truck was also missing. Investigators listed it as stolen and added its information to the growing NCIC report on Gilbert and Elliott. Detectives also took the receipt found in the Brewer's car to the Oklahoma City pawn shop that issued it. 2 video games and a socket wrench set had been pawned the day before the murdered woman was found. They showed the receipt to an employee. He vaguely remembered Gilbert and Elliott, but he had something else that might be stronger than memory. The pawn shop was equipped with a 24-hour surveillance camera. The videotape confirmed his story. September 3rd was the last confirmed sighting of Gilbert and Elliott. The FBI issued 2 more warrants for the suspected killers for unlawful interstate flight. Agent Peter Christ and his team were frustrated that after 6 days, 4 victims, and thousands of man-hours, the killers remained a half day ahead of the FBI.
A lot of things were going through my mind. Number one, we didn't want another double homicide, and we didn't want another killing anyplace. And we were, I guess, what I kept thinking about, what have I not done? What lead have I not sent out? Let me look everything over again to see maybe if we can somehow get ahead of these guys instead of being behind them for a half a day or a day.
The nationwide hunt for Gilbert and Elliott intensified. Law enforcement agencies mobilized additional helicopters to search for Roxy Ruddle's 2-toned pickup truck on routes heading west. Long-haul truck drivers were also notified to report any sightings on the road or at rest stops. Hundreds of calls poured into police in Oklahoma, Missouri, and Ohio. But none led to the fugitives' immediate whereabouts.
Every time the phone rang, I was very concerned that it would be another body. And that's a terrible feeling when you're working a case like this, when you know what has happened up to that point and what you envision. The worst thing you can envision in your mind would happen is if this thing continued. So every time the phone rang and somebody said it was for me, that was my biggest fear. That was the first thing that came into my mind. Oh, we found another body.
The two suspected spree killers had chosen elderly people and women as their prey. And the FBI didn't know where or whom they would strike next. By September 5th, 1994, after a week of searching, the FBI and local law enforcement were no closer to finding two suspects in a killing spree that spanned 3 states. Agents believe that 22-year-old Lewis Gilbert and 16-year-old Eric Elliott were headed to the home of Elliott's mother in California, driving a stolen 2-tone pickup truck with Oklahoma plates. Missouri Lieutenant Timothy Daimler feared the murder suspects would kill again if they decided to steal another car as they traveled west.
I wasn't thinking serial killer at the time. I guess what was going through my mind at the time that was these guys didn't care who they killed, and I was thinking that we need to catch these people.
News reports and bulletins alerted people in western states that the suspected killers were headed their way, armed and dangerous. In New Mexico, state police criminal agent Daniel Becker first heard about the fugitives through the media.
My initial thought was that the chances of them being apprehended in New Mexico were extremely slim because of the wide open spaces that we have and a relatively small amount of law enforcement that we have throughout the state.
The same day the reports began to hit the news in New Mexico, Gilbert and Elliott stopped at the rural home of an older couple 15 miles south of Santa Fe. They claimed that the stolen 2-tone pickup truck was low on gas. The couple agreed to help. The fugitives said they were on their way to California, but the woman was suspicious since she didn't see any luggage in the truck. To her, they seemed jumpy and left in a hurry when they heard the noise of nearby construction workers.
State Police Santa Fe, this is Carmen.
The woman reported the sighting to the New Mexico State Police. But by the time units arrived to investigate, the two young men were nowhere in sight. The following morning of September 6th, a New Mexico man reported another sighting to police.
How you doing?
He claimed to have seen Gilbert and Elliott the previous night. The man told the officers that he first encountered them while driving on Highway 599 outside Santa Fe. The motorist saw two young hitchhikers and pulled over to pick them up.
How's it going?
Thanks for picking us up.
They said their pickup truck had gotten stuck in the mud. He didn't realize who they were until he saw their photos on the news the next morning, describing them as suspected killers.
Want to know if they can get a ride to the mall.
The witness said he gave the pair a ride to the store where they bought food and gas. Later that night, he saw them again and drove them back to the place they had first met. It was a desolate part of the highway. The officer needed a landmark to estimate where the motorist had dropped the fugitives. The man said it was close to a small overpass. In the chance that the fugitives were still in the area, he alerted all area law enforcement. The New Mexico State Police were aware they had to move fast. Two units raced to the location to conduct a search for any trace of the suspected murderers. They found the overpass in a remote area. Reports had warned that the Ohio men were armed. Gilbert and Elliott would be tired and desperate after running and hiding for 7 days with little money. Officers prepared for the worst.
Probably leave contact cover, okay? Once we got him, we'll give you the signal.
If the fugitives were still in the area, they had miles of shrubs and hills behind which they could conceal themselves and take aim at anyone approaching.
Just wait there. Exactly.
Officers were instructed to use extreme caution.
So you guys go on the north side, we're going on the south side, okay? Good luck. You'll get my signal.
The team wanted to bring them back alive. They scanned the dust for footprints, food wrappers, and soda bottles. Anything that might indicate the suspected killers were still in the area. They approached one of 6 culverts underneath the highway. Carefully, they moved forward for a closer look. One officer spotted 2 men lying on the ground inside, apparently sleeping.
Hey, police! Put your hands up! Let me see your hands! Put your hands up! Put your hands up! Be smart! Put your hands up!
One of the startled men appeared to be groping for his gun in the dark. In the next split second, officers had to decide whether they needed to use deadly force to stop the suspected spree killers. On September 6, 1994, New Mexico State Police were within a few feet of murder suspects Louis Gilbert and Eric Elliott. The fugitives reached for their weapons, but chose not to die. After a murder spree that took the lives of 4 victims in less than a week, the pair was arrested without a struggle. The 1,800-mile chase had ended. FBI Special Agent Peter Christ got the news of their arrest in Ohio.
My reaction, of course, when I received that news was a tremendous sigh of relief. The first thing I wanted to know, it was after they'd been caught, were there any bodies, were there any unsolved homicides close to where they were arrested? Of course, the answer was no. Just a tremendous sigh of relief that this whole thing was finally over.
Officers recovered a .22 handgun and a green soda bottle at the campsite where the pair were apprehended. They also found the bedspread belonging to the murdered Mrs. Brewer. State police found Roxy Ruddle's stolen pickup 2 miles away near a racetrack in Santa Fe. Like their other 2 stolen vehicles, the truck was stuck in the mud. Examining fingerprints, crime scene and lab investigators matched personal items to the murdered woman in Oklahoma City. Investigators also found another green soda bottle, the same brand they had found under the culvert and in Ruth Loder's car. Eric Elliott and Louis Gilbert were taken to the New Mexico State Police District Office in Santa Fe. If they could turn one against the other, their prosecution would be assured. 16-year-old Eric Elliott made one phone call to his father in Ohio and refused to say anything about the killings. Now it was Louis Gilbert's turn. The ex-convict waived his rights and agreed to be interviewed. New Mexico State Police criminal agent Daniel Becker had little time to prepare.
Gilbert revealed very little during the first hour of our interview about these killings. A couple times he made mention of, I asked him if he had did this out of, for some justifiable reason or if he's a cold-blooded killer. And he responded by saying, one of those.
Gilbert claimed that he didn't recall what had happened over the past 5 days. He refused to say anything about the murders or Mrs. Loader's disappearance. Frustrated, the investigator left the room. A few moments alone was all Gilbert needed.
After we had taken our first break, Gilbert began to open up a little bit more, and he actually made an admission that he had killed between 1 and 5 people. And when I had asked him why he'd killed people, he said for stupid reasons.
Gilbert began by recounting the day he met the woman in Oklahoma. He said that he and Elliot struck up a conversation with Roxy Ruddle when they found her fishing alone in a secluded area of Draper Lake near Oklahoma City. They told her that their car was stuck in the mud and needed a ride back to town. She offered to help and packed up her gear. Her pickup truck was parked just up the hill.
Give me the keys. Now, come on, quick. Tie her up.
When her back was turned, Gilbert pulled the .22 pistol Elliot had taken from his parents' Ohio home. Then Gilbert told Elliot to tie Ruddle's hands. Gilbert said Ruddle cried and asked them not to hurt her. Elliot stayed behind while Gilbert marched Ruddle into the woods. He told her to sit down at the base of a tree. Then he shot Roxy Ruddle. Now that Gilbert had admitted to one murder, the agent pressed him on the others. He asked the confessed killer to describe what had happened in Missouri the day before he got to Oklahoma.
Gilbert advised me that they had been traveling through the state of Missouri, and the evening before the murders, they had parked the stolen vehicle that they had obtained in Ohio in what I was led to believe was a field. And they'd slept in the vehicle overnight, and the following morning or afternoon when they were about to leave, they realized the vehicle was stuck. So they needed to get another vehicle.
As Missouri investigators believed, Gilbert and Elliot had simply walked to the closest house and saw a car in the driveway. It was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Brewer. Gilbert decided they'd ask to use the phone to call for a tow.
Hello, sir. How you doing? Oh, pretty good. We got our car. Thank you so much.
Wanting to help, the Brewers let the young men in.
Once inside, they learned that they didn't have a telephone book, so they couldn't come up with a number to call for a wrecker. And it's at that point that Gilbert told me that he decided, or they decided, that they were going to kill the Brewers.
Come on, move it.
They led the grandfather and grandmother into the basement.
Back to me. Keep going.
Then executed them. There was one more crime that Gilbert had not discussed.
We're walking down some railroad tracks.
The elderly cancer patient from Ohio, Mrs. Loader, was still missing and presumed dead.
See if we can get the keys for it.
No one knew what had become of her. On the evening of August 29, 1994, Lewis Gilbert and Eric Elliott approached Mrs. Loader's Port Washington home to steal her car. Since no one answered when they knocked, they believed the house was empty.
Stick it in. Cheap out. Stick it in.
so they broke in to search for the car keys.
This old lady.
After 10 minutes, they still hadn't found the keys. As they rummaged through the living room, they were startled when Mrs. Loader suddenly appeared. He claimed Mrs. Loader was still alive when he locked her in the trunk of her car and sped off.
They got about 4 miles outside of town in a wooded area, and they pulled up alongside of a guardrail and parked, got outside. Gilbert told me that he opened the trunk and he picked up Mrs. Loader out of the trunk, and they took her off the road near the guardrail, about 5 feet from the side of the road.
Gilbert said he forced Mrs. Loader to walk away from the car. He said he shot her with the same .22 that had killed the others.
We drove a little ways, and
Gilbert had finished his description of the murders. But he hadn't told the agent where they could find the murdered Ohio woman.
We knew it was crucial to find Mrs. Loader's body, both as evidence so this murder could be prosecuted, and also just simply as closure for the family so that they could find her and make for proper arrangements for a funeral.
Gilbert gave authorities directions to find Mrs. Loader's remains. 50 people from the FBI and 12 different law enforcement and volunteer groups followed Gilbert's directions. They searched for the dead woman in fields and woods and hills for days. But the 79-year-old widow and mother of 4 was never found. Sheriff Walter Wilson continues to work the open case.
When you work a murder case, you almost become part of a family, so to speak, because your goal obviously is to solve the crime, to help the victims, the surviving victims, as much as you possibly can. It's something obviously that will never ever be forgotten. I have a high respect for the Loader family, having got to know them very well. I feel bad to this day that we've not yet been able to recover Mrs. Loader's remains.
16-year-old Eric Elliott stood trial as an adult in Oklahoma. Elliott was found guilty of first-degree murder for his participation in the killing of Roxy Ruddle. He was sentenced to life without parole. In Missouri, after 57 years of marriage, the Brewers were laid to rest. Unlike the family of Ruth Loader, the Brewer family was able to have some closure for their tragic loss. After being sentenced to death for the murder of Roxy Ruddle in Oklahoma, Lewis Gilbert was extradited to Missouri, where he stood trial for the murders of William and Flossie Brewer.
Lewis, where's Ruth? Where's the lady in Ohio? Where's Ruth, Lewis? Give her family a break.
He remained silent on the whereabouts of Ruth Loader's remains. Since the Ohio woman has not yet been recovered, there has been no trial date set to answer for her kidnapping and murder. For her family and friends, Gilbert and Elliott's actions are unconscionable.
I've often thought what goes through their mind or what causes them to do that, and I really, it's hard to understand or think what they're thinking, other than obviously they have to be very evil people.
2 brutal murders in 2 small towns, located hundreds of miles apart. The crimes seem random and unrelated. As investigators search for a motive, they make a startling discovery. Both murders are the work of a cunning crime ring. Local police and the FBI must untangle a web of lies to stop a dangerous gang that will kill a man for his identity.
In the United States, identity theft costs citizens billions of dollars. In some cases, it costs the lives of innocent people. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. In 1999, a bizarre murder led agents and police on a manhunt across the South. Their mission, to catch a killer who stole the identities of his victims and had the survival skills to disappear forever.
In Henderson County, Kentucky, on March 10th at 3 a.m., the Sheriff's Department receives a bizarre call. A man reports that a stranger is outside his home. The resident tells police that the stranger broke into his truck and is sitting in his driveway honking the horn repeatedly. When sheriff's deputies arrive, they find the attempted car thief is a 62-year-old man. He is soaking wet and suffering from severe hypothermia. The man identifies himself as Richard Dorman. He says 2 men abducted him at gunpoint and threw him in the Green River. He tells police he broke into the truck to try and get someone to help him. Police take him to the hospital. Lieutenant Frank Gropp of the Henderson County Sheriff's Department is called out to question Richard Dorman. Lieutenant Gropp does not recognize the name, but he knows the face.
It's between 2 and 3 in the morning, and we converge at the hospital. As soon as I see the guy, he looks like the photograph. He's the guy in the photograph.
The photo is from a bank surveillance camera. Gropp has been searching for the mysterious man in the photo for 4 weeks, ever since he responded to an emergency call to a local farm. Farmer Jack Norris lived alone in Henderson, Kentucky. On February 3rd, Lieutenant Gropp made a gruesome discovery after a call from one of Norris's neighbors.
When I got out there, deputies led me to a building adjacent to the victim's home. In the building, the victim had kept hay, and it's a shed, actually, open-faced. And the contents of the shed was hay from the floor to the top, with a space to the left where you could walk. And over in that space was the victim's body. And at that point, we knew we had a murder.
Jack Norris's body was covered with blood. It appeared he was beaten to death.
Looked like something had punctured his back several times. There was a pickaxe up toward the entrance. Closer examination, we could see blood on the handle.
Blood on the handle?
On the pick itself. An inch or more of the pickaxe was wet.
Deputies continued to search the area. Near a wood pile, Gropp found a pile of hay. Underneath are dried blood stains.
Closer inspection, I could see blood splatter up and along the wood that was stacked there, which was telling me that was the actual point of impact. That's the scene of the crime right there.
Gropp found a heavy iron pole next to the stack of wood. There was blood on it.
To pick up an item that is that heavy and beat a man in the head like that, it would tell me that the person that's swinging this weapon is angry, aggressive. He's doing it with force and doing it with a purpose.
Investigators searched the victim's house for clues. They hoped that inside they would find something to help them make sense of this senseless act.
Definitely had time.
Norris's home was ransacked. Drawers and cabinets were opened and searched.
Whoever this was took their time. Either took their time or there's more than one individual doing 2 things at the same time.
Although the murderer tore the room apart, nothing of any value appeared to be missing. In fact, the victim's wallet was found in his pocket.
One of the things that struck us was the calendars were still on January 31st, which was Sunday. They had not been flipped over to February 1st. So, as an educated guess, we put the murder at Monday morning. Later, we used the mail carrier and the mail that was in the mailbox, and pretty much that confirmed. He never did get his mail from Monday.
Sheriff's deputies canvassed the area. The victim's neighbors provide an intriguing clue.
Right away, the neighbors telling us that this man carried 2 wallets. We have a wallet missing. It's the wallet with his ID. One wallet he had ID, the other wallet he carried for different reasons. But the wallet and ID is missing.
The second wallet and the missing ID only added to the puzzle. Police recalled finding an empty box of checks at the victim's home. Gropp thought perhaps he'd found the motive. News of the Norris murder spreads quickly. Local residents were afraid. Who did this and why? For days, the Henderson County Sheriff's Office tried to unravel the crime, but nothing seemed to make sense. Then, suddenly, they got an unexpected break. A bank in Union County called with intriguing information.
The bank notified us that they had received a check from an individual off of Mr. Norris's account, that they had compared the signatures, and that, from what they could tell, was a forgery.
The only thing missing from the Norris home was an ID and a box full of checks. Perhaps the missing checks would lead them to Norris's killer.
We went to the bank. This was just an excellent tape of this individual standing there at the counter, white hair. He had signed the name or used the name Cleo Campbell.
The man with white hair is Richard Dorman. Hours after Jack Norris's murder, Dorman called himself Cleo Campbell and cashed a check on Norris's account for $1,100, almost the exact balance in the account. Lieutenant Gropp knows who Dorman is, but why was Dorman posing as Cleo Campbell? After the Norris robbery, when Gropp got the photo, he began searching for Campbell.
We checked surrounding counties for the person and the name, Cleo Campbell.
There was no Cleo Campbell that met the description in the area.
We go on the internet, we look up every Cleo Campbell that we can find nationwide. If I found a Cleo Campbell in any particular state, I would contact the local law enforcement agency, and they'd call me back one after the other and saying, this is not the guy.
Investigators searched for the elusive Cleo Campbell for weeks, but nothing panned out. It was as if Campbell never existed. Then Gropp learned that Campbell was the name of a robbery victim in Alabama. The mystery surrounding Richard Dorman was deepening. Lieutenant Gropp has a lot he wants to ask Dorman.
And I said, well, Cleo, and I said, you don't mind if I call you Cleo, do you? That's how I've come to know you. And his eyes are just, they get big.
Dorman realizes he's been caught.
And in a real polite manner, he says, look, I don't want you boys to be offended, but this goes across state lines. You're going to need some federal people on this. You're going to need the FBI.
Lieutenant Gropp calls in the FBI. Special Agent Paul Pape is brought in to interview Richard Dorman. Dorman launches into an incredible story. He tells the agent that he agreed to meet a man named Charlie Stewart at a truck stop in Clarksville, Tennessee.
Charlie Stewart, according to Dorman, was the ringleader of this group that went around and stole checks and cashed checks and assumed other people's identities. He said that he was a check casher.
Charlie provided Dorman with false identification in the Norris check. The day before he was abducted, Dorman was told there was a problem and Charlie wanted to talk to him about it. Special Agent Paul Pape.
As he waited for Stewart, a young male came up to his car and said, are you Richard Dorman? And Dorman says, yeah, I am. What's it to you? And at that point, the young male lunged at Dorman and tried to start, he had a stun gun in his hand and was trying to stun him with this stun gun. Another older gentleman came around to Dorman's car and had a gun, a little Derringer, and pointed that right at Dorman. And at that point, Dorman, seeing the gun, stopped resisting and said, basically, what's this all about? And the older gentleman said, Charlie wants to see you.
Dorman and the two men drive north until they reach the Green River in Kentucky.
Dorman said they pulled over on a dirt road there right next to the river, got Dorman out of the car, and went to the back of the trunk. They gave Dorman a cigarette. The older male said to Dorman that we got to take you to see Charlie, but before we do that, we need you to get into the trunk.
Dorman had no choice. The two men demanded his wallet.
And all of a sudden, the vehicle takes off with him in a trunk and plunges over about a 20-foot embankment into the Green River. When the vehicle hits the river, the trunk pops open. Dorman is able to swim out of the trunk before the car submerges. He grabs onto a log and drifts downstream probably 100, 200 yards. The abductors think at this time, well, he's either drowned or he's going to freeze to death because of the temperature of the water.
Dorman tells agents he had never met the two men who tried to kill him, but he certainly worked for Charlie Stewart. Stewart is a man all too familiar to Lieutenant Gropp. A man Gropp believes must have been involved in Jack Norris's murder. Now he has to prove it. In Henderson, Kentucky, a mysterious man claims two men tried to kill him by throwing him into the Green River.
How did you get the front?
He tells police a known criminal named Charlie Stewart is behind his kidnapping and attempted murder. Henderson County Sheriff's investigator, Lieutenant Frank Gropp, knows Stewart only too well.
Charlie Stewart is infamous in this area. He's well known. He's been involved in all sorts of different criminal activity.
Charlie Stewart is a suspect in the murder of a farmer in Kentucky. And Stewart is also wanted in connection with a homicide in Alabama. On the morning of February 8th in Alabama, 5 days after the Norris murder in Kentucky, a Morgan County deputy responded to a call. Someone abandoned a van at the old Gum Pond rock quarry. The front end of the vehicle was submerged. The deputy checked out the back. Inside, he found an old quilt, stacks of paperwork, and the body of a man. The victim's wrists were bound. His face was covered with duct tape.
Body in the van at the rock quarry. He was not breathing. You could not see any chest movement at all. It was obvious that he was dead.
Detective Terry Kelly is a criminal investigator with the Morgan County Sheriff's Office.
When an officer comes across what appears to be especially a homicide, but any crime scene that can be processed for evidence, he observes what he can backs off, calls the investigators, and we arrive and take the scene from there.
Investigators secured the scene and waited for the forensic team to arrive. Captain Mike Corley.
Patience is hard in a case like this, but we knew that the damaging of evidence or the contaminating of evidence would be crucial in court.
Xander, Kelly, forensics here.
The forensic unit arrived at the rock quarry. The victim was a white male. He appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s.
The forensics persons started their processing of the scene, which is photographing, measuring, checking to see if they could observe any latent prints on the vehicle that would be worth processing.
All right, let's see if we can get it open.
Investigators opened the other door and spotted a dark blanket.
Let me see your hands. Let me see your hands now.
And we saw that move. Someone says there's movement.
It's kind of scared all of us, I'll tell you the truth. We were not expecting that.
Get an ambulance. We're gonna need an ambulance. All right.
Under the material, investigators found a woman. She had been badly beaten.
She was duct taped up also. She was had a duct tape around her mouth, around her hands.
What happened? What happened to you?
Police questioned the only survivor, Florence Nichols.
Seemed forever, but it was a long
She told them what happened.
Did you see what the guys looked like?
Florence and her son James had just gotten home from a flea market.
He was a businessman. You know, he had a little shop that it was kind of a mom and pop type gun trading and guitars and musical instruments. And they lived together in Eva, and they pretty much always had there in the Eva community.
A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was a young man asking for directions. He forced his way into the house, and then he attacked her.
It was just a small, I don't know much about.
But she tells investigators she heard a second man's voice.
Did you hear their?
As far as she could tell, he ran through the living room and down the hall where her son James was. A few minutes later, she was thrown into the back of her own van. Something very heavy was thrown on top of her. It was the body of her son. According to Florence, the van drove for a few minutes, then stopped.
She had been in that van for probably 14 to 16 hours, as best as we can reconstruct. The whole time with her son, who was deceased on top of her, fearing for her own life. It had to have been horrendous. I'm amazed that she survived. She knew deep down that these people intended to kill her. I think she had no doubt in her mind.
Florence Nichols described her attackers. The man who came to the door was young, late teens or early 20s. She didn't get a look at the other one. She had no idea why anybody would want to hurt her or her son. Investigators searched the Nichols home looking for clues. Nothing appeared to be missing.
We had a fairly large gun collection. There was a fairly large amount of knives, collectible knives. There was so much stuff left that would have been good items to steal. It doesn't appear to be a robbery. If it's not a robbery, why would they kill someone? What was the motive? What was going on? So it's a very strange case at first.
Investigators returned to the Nichols home. They wanted to go over the house a second time in case they missed something. This time, Florence Nichols told them she carefully went through her belongings and discovered a few items were missing. Some collectible guns, some knives, about $200 in cash, and her son's checkbook.
If those checks are going to show up somewhere forged and pass somewhere else, you know, that could lead you back to your perpetrator. So in a way, it's good news that the checkbook was missing.
The FBI and police are now working 2 homicides and a string of robberies they suspect are linked to Charlie Stewart. There was an eerie parallel between the Alabama and the Kentucky murder cases. Lieutenant Frank Gropp.
Charlie Stewart being from here, it's an obvious connection from here to there. The type of murder is the same. It appeared that the man in Alabama was murdered for his identification, and that fits what we're looking at. So at that point, we kind of focus on Charlie Stewart. When a case comes together, that's exciting. And when the pieces fell together like this, that was just, it was more than I could ask for. We felt that this was it.
But to solve the puzzle, investigators must first find Charlie Stewart. Agents turn up the pressure on Dorman. Dorman begins to give the agents the details of Charlie Stewart and his deadly identity theft ring.
Dorman had been working with Stewart for a couple of 3 years. He was always provided with ID that at least appeared to be him or looked like him. He would walk into a bank very calmly, knowing he had a stolen check and sometimes a check of a dead man, and was passing that and wouldn't even break a sweat, not a nervous bone in his body. He was a pro.
Ironically, Dorman himself was targeted by Stewart's deadly scam. When Stewart hired 2 men to kill Dorman, they took his wallet before they dumped his body. So far, police and the FBI have identified 2 members of the identity theft ring. Richard Dorman is in custody, but the most dangerous one, suspected murderer Charlie Stewart, is still on the run, along with his unnamed accomplices. The FBI and police hope Dorman can lead them to the men before they target another victim. The FBI and police in Alabama and Kentucky are working 2 homicide investigations they think were engineered by the same man, Charlie Stewart. In Alabama, a man was found murdered in a van beside his badly beaten mother at a rock quarry. The night before the bodies were found, a deputy responded to a call at the rock quarry. A resident complained that someone had stolen his tractor. When the deputy first arrived to check out the area, he saw a gray 1977 Pontiac Grand Prix. The vehicle's hood felt warm, but the driver was gone. The deputy got the plate numbers and searched for the driver. But when he got back, the Grand Prix was gone. The Grand Prix was parked 150 yards from where the van was found the next morning. Captain Mike Corley.
It was just too coincidental to have not been related.
The gray Grand Prix was now investigators' best lead. Investigator Terry Kelly.
It was decided to put out what we call a bolo, be on the lookout for this vehicle, this gray Pontiac. So that was broadcast over the air to local law enforcement. News media likes to have scanners. They picked up on it, of course, questioned us. And we responded, let them know that, yes, we were looking for this vehicle. It was a vehicle of interest, possibly in this homicide. We simply wanted to talk to the people that were in it, see if they saw or heard anything unusual in that area that night. We had several telephone calls, several sightings.
Tips came in, but none of them turned out to be the car they were looking for.
We appreciate you coming in, sir.
A few days later, a local man contacted the Morgan County Sheriff's Office with a promising tip. He told investigators that they should take a look at a man by the name of Larry Butler, who owned a gray Grand Prix. According to the man, Butler left town on a motorcycle around the time of James Nichols' murder. The Grand Prix had not been seen since. When police pulled up Butler's criminal record, they learned that Larry Butler was an alias. His real name was Charlie Stewart.
He has numerous aliases and a long, long criminal history. Burglaries, robberies, violent crimes, and a current warrant on him out of the state of Florida. When you see somebody with that kind of criminal history that suddenly disappears the night of a homicide and nobody's heard from since, you know, I might be a little cynical as a law enforcement officer, but it makes you a little suspicious.
Lieutenant Chuck Zanda from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office makes several visits to Stewart's home, the trailer in an isolated area. Each time, Stewart's wife tells him she has no idea where he is.
Do you have any idea when the last time you saw him?
Investigators also question Stewart's neighbors.
We'll be in touch.
We had received word that Charles Stewart had come to one of his neighbors and wanted him to cash a check on a dead man's account. Of course, that sent up flags for us. He was very afraid of Stewart. He was convinced that Mr. Stewart would set his trailer on fire and wait until he ran outside and shoot him as he came out. That was his words. That's the kind of person he thought Stewart was.
That's the reason I didn't come.
The neighbor also tells investigators that the day before Nichols' murder, he saw Stewart in his Grand Prix with two other men.
I seen his car.
Unfortunately, he didn't get a good look at the men with Stewart. Agents and police hit another dead end. The FBI is involved in an intense manhunt to try and capture suspected murderer Charlie Stewart and shut down his identity theft ring. Agents already have one of his accomplices, Richard Dorman, in custody, but he hasn't been able to lead them to the fugitive. After weeks of working the stalled case, the FBI gets a break. Special Agent Paul Pape.
Someone calls me at the office and said that they had information that I needed to hear. This person tells us that the two people responsible for these murders are Billy Lyon and his father, Larry Lyon, both from Henderson, Kentucky.
According to the cooperator, Billy Lyon told her they intended to rob a tobacco store in Evansville, Indiana, where he used to work. He planned to kill the manager and steal the safe.
And that was supposed to happen fairly quickly. So with this information, a new sense of urgency is placed on the case where we not only have old murders, but now we have one that's pending. So we have to act immediately on it.
Lieutenant Frank Gropp of the Henderson County, Kentucky Sheriff's Office.
Have you ever seen any of these men?
Agent Paul Pape and I, along with City Police, set up a photo array which consists of 6 or more photographs of like individuals who look similar. And we show that to Dorman.
Dorman quickly picks Larry Lyon and his son, 18-year-old Billy Lyon, out of the photo array.
We initiate surveillance on Billy Lyon's house in Evansville, Indiana, with the FBI and the Evansville police. And we also have the house in Henderson, Kentucky, where Larry Lyon is living under surveillance. The plan was to go obtain search warrants and arrest warrants both in Indiana and Kentucky for the two suspects, their houses, their cars, and get everyone coordinated, bring up the extra help from surrounding areas to coordinate these searches. But as all plans go, this one didn't work out.
There he is. There he is.
Billy Lyon leaves his house and heads toward Henderson, where his father lives.
Let's go, guys. Let's go.
So at this point, we have to make a decision. Do we let Billy Lyon go and run the risk of, one, losing him, or two, him going to Larry Lyon's house and coordinate with him to go do this tobacco store murder? So we made the decision that we needed to stop Billy Lyon and arrest him.
Driver, turn off ignition and put your hands out.
Shortly after they entered into the state of Kentucky, the Henderson Police Department pulled Billy Lyon's vehicle over, along with undercover units from Evansville PD and the FBI, and we took Billy Lyon into custody.
Agents questioned Billy Lyon at the Evansville police station.
You could tell from his attitude that he knew at that point that the gig was up. He is obviously apprehensive about speaking to us.
As Billy is being questioned, Henderson deputies maintain surveillance on his father's residence. They observe Larry Lyon leave in a hurry.
Yeah, he's leaving now. Go pick him up.
Authorities fear Lyon has heard about his son being arrested and that he's trying to make a run for it. Lieutenant Frank Grubb.
At that point in time, I believe you have one city cruiser that's behind him that initiates a stop. The city officer would hold his position until other officers arrived. But Larry Lyon never gave that chance to happen.
Hold it, right. Stop. Put your hands out the window.
Larry Lyon is rushed to a hospital in Evansville, where he dies of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. At the Evansville police station, Special Agent Pape continues to question Billy Lyon.
I don't understand why you would just...
My thought is if I tell him that his father just killed himself, that will be the end of the interview, understandably. So I didn't tell him about his father at that point. I continued with the interview. At first, it was almost like pulling teeth to try to get him to say anything. And he really opened up when I told him that I knew Charlie Stewart was behind this, and that, you know, he was responsible for, at least in part, in telling you and Larry to go ahead and commit these murders. And the first thing that Billy said to me was, Charlie Stewart's a psycho. And he proceeded to tell us about the Jack Norris murder and the Nichols murder in Alabama and the kidnapping of Dorman and putting him into the river. He laid all the guilt on Stewart, that Stewart was directing them to do that.
Billy Lyon tells Special Agent Pape that Stewart will be impossible to catch. He's smart. He knows how to survive in the wilderness, and he's extremely dangerous. In Alabama and Kentucky, FBI agents and local law enforcement dismantle a gang of identity thieves willing to kill a man for his driver's license. Only one member remains at large, the ringleader, Charlie Stewart. The FBI closes in on the fugitive. Two of Stewart's associates, now in custody, tell authorities the fugitive is dangerous, self-sufficient, and able to live off the land. Investigator Terry Kelly has helped chase Stewart for more than a year.
He supposedly had money stashed in several different locations that he could keep running to. He was excellent in the woods and able to hide out, a master of disguise. And Mr. Stewart was very good at changing his appearance.
A combined task force of FBI agents and local law enforcement raid Stewart's trailer.
Clear!
Special Agent Scott Broshears.
We didn't find any evidence on the murders, but we did find a lot of interesting things. He had cut a hole in the bottom of his house trailer where he could get out the back. We found a van that was like in the bushes that we didn't even see it when we first arrived, but it had like a telephone wire out there where we could have communications back to his house trailer.
Clear, clear, clear.
Inside the van, agents find 20 weapons and ammunition.
He could have used it as a bunker and held off people for a long time. So we knew that he was not going to be an easy catch, and if we did come across him, it was probably going to be a battle.
Got a van there for guns and ammunition.
Apparently, Stewart has been preparing for this moment for a long time, and now he's gone.
No signs of him?
Basically, my job now is, since Stewart lived in my area, was to try to find Charlie Stewart. Even though Stewart seemed to be a ruthless individual, he did value his family.
As time passes, agents keep up the pressure on Stewart's wife. She continues to claim her husband has not contacted her.
Our sources would tell us that his wife was very afraid of him, even though she would protect him. She was also afraid of him.
Months pass. There is no sign of Stewart.
It is frustrating. It's very frustrating. You work as hard as you can, you develop the leads as fast as you can, you look everywhere you can think of looking.
After nearly a year, Stewart is featured on a national crime show.
We got very few leads, which we felt was unusual, because a lot of times you get a lot of leads and more than you can handle, and you have to start picking and choosing the good ones, but we got very few leads, so that kind of led us to believe, well, he's in hiding somewhere, and it's probably going to be in the Kentucky area that he knows real well, or the Alabama area.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Lieutenant Brashears with the FBI.
Agents re-interview the fugitive's neighbors. They are too afraid to say whether or not they have seen Charlie Stewart.
If Stewart found out that they had talked to us or given any information, he would get him killed somehow. And they really believed that. They were usually scared to death of him and really wouldn't give us a lot of information. As time went on, and as I kind of were able to develop a little rapport with a few of the people, they started cooperating a little bit, and they realized that as scared as they were, they're probably better off getting him captured than having him out on the loose.
You know what day it was?
Slowly, Stewart's neighbors begin to give agents information.
That's all you got?
We were able to find out that his wife had bought like a sleeping bag and was buying some clothes that were too big for her kids. She bought size 11 boots, and none of her kids wore size 11, or she had maybe a 14-year-old, but I was pretty sure his feet weren't that big.
It's just more evidence that Stewart is hiding in the area. Authorities try a different approach.
We developed several sources within the FBI that we thought we could send in to talk to Stewart's wife, just casually to ask questions about this and that.
Yes.
The FBI brings in a friend of Stewart's who has agreed to help police. The man has known Stewart for years. He agrees to wear a wire so agents can listen in on his conversation with Stewart's wife.
At this point, you know, we're kind of sitting on the edge of our seats. We're just really confident that he's probably going to be there.
The cooperator approaches the trailer.
The source went in, nobody was there. He knocked on the door, didn't see anything, and he had to walk back down the dirt road to get back to his car. And then as he gets in his car, he looks in his rearview mirror and he thought he saw someone back at the trailer. And he thought it was Charlie Stewart. And he looked around and he didn't see the person again. Then he's telling us, you know, I'm sure I saw Stewart up the trailer. So I just got a quick glimpse, but, you know, when I turned around, it wasn't there, but I'm pretty sure I saw him up there.
Special Agent Paul Pape.
Who knows what could have happened or what he was armed with at that time. It would have been Russian roulette to send us in there, trying to apprehend him at that time. You just don't bum rush the woods to try to find the guy. It has to be, you have to outfox the fox.
Agents and police must come up with a plan to trap the dangerous fugitive. Fugitive Charles Stewart is wanted for bank fraud, kidnapping, murder for hire, and murder.
And if you're looking for
The FBI and Alabama authorities believe he is hiding out in the dense woods behind his home. Special Agent Scott Broshears.
We kind of started putting together the theory that, okay, he's living back in this woods, either in a tent or in one of those little caves. Maybe he comes back after the sun goes down, spends the night with the family. Before the sun comes up, he heads back out in the woods. I went out with 3 or 4 of the guys from our office, and we just hiked out in the woods like we were just hunters.
When the agents find evidence Stewart's hiding in the woods, Chuck Zanda and Terry Kelly from the Morgan County Sheriff's Office bring in a canine unit to track Stewart down.
I'd been looking for Charlie Stewart for approximately a year by now. Put a lot of hours in it, and nothing was really coming up to where I was finding him. So I wasn't real optimistic, or I probably would have taken more people with me.
Not far from the trailer, the dogs pick up a scent. Detective Terry Kelly.
Dogs hit a hot track, and they hit it hard, and they hit it fast, almost immediately. And the chase was on.
And the dogs immediately took us to a tree and were barking up a tree, which kind of made us a little scared, thinking he might be in the tree, and we saw a deer stand.
The deer stand was empty. But the agents were not far behind Stewart. The dogs follow the scent down a ravine to a creek.
We got down a little ways and the dogs found a cave. We kind of backed off a little bit because we didn't know what was in the cave. Dogs went in the cave, come back out, but it wasn't real deep, and with our flashlights and things we had, we were able to see there was food, fresh food, the sleeping bag, other camping supplies.
Stewart can't be far away.
All of a sudden, you see Scott Broshears bounding through the field, and it looks like he's doing about a 4-minute mile. He's hauling, and he's coming to tell us we got a hot track. We got a hot track. We found his cave. We're on him.
Guys here.
Captain Mike Corley.
As quick as I could, I called, and I got a roll call of everybody that was in service that day. I called for the air unit. I began to get things in place.
We had state police responding, some of the local police officers from the local cities and the sheriff's office trying to establish a perimeter around this 2 by 5 mile wooded area.
You know, I probably had between 20 and 30 officers out there.
As the dog team calls in their location, Corley positions his men.
Every time I got a chance to shift an officer 100 yards, that just took 100 yards away from him. I wanted to tighten that area down, close that noose in around him to where he had nowhere to go.
After probably close to 3 hours of chasing him through the woods, I finally hear on my radio from one of the other sheriff's deputies that a guy's been spotted running out of the woods.
Help! Stewart is cornered. He pulls out a gun.
Put the weapon down!
And now probably comes the worst point of the whole search. As we're hearing that they're closing in and the deputies think they have him, I hear shots have been fired.
I hear gunshots.
I don't know if it's, one of our guys, the dog handlers, or... But then a few seconds later, we did hear nobody was hurt and that Stewart had been captured.
The chase was over. A long, long chase was over. The chase had started almost 1.5 years before. Charlie was a scary man. There was a coldness in his eyes, a very, very scary coldness. I'm very glad he was in custody. Very glad.
In January 2002, Stewart and his gang are tried and found guilty of bank fraud, kidnapping, and murder. Richard Dorman receives a life sentence for his role in the crimes. Billy Lyon is also sentenced to life. Charles Lewis Stewart is convicted on all counts. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Authorities believe Charlie Stewart masterminded the entire operation. He ordered Larry and Billy Lyon to rob Jack Norris and James Nichols. He then handed off the victims' stolen IDs and checkbooks to Richard Dorman, the fourth member of the gang, so he could clean out their bank accounts. Stewart chose his victims carefully, based on their resemblance to Dorman. It's a disturbing scenario. 2 innocent men are dead simply because of the way they looked. The unrelenting investigation by local police and federal agents put this ring of killers and thieves behind bars forever.